And good afternoon for the official start of today's WorldOregon webinar, Just Dessert, the International Labor Organization, and Theo Chocolate talking about a very important issue. We're thrilled to have our partners here, as you see them up on screen, from Theo Chocolate and the International Labor Organization. I will introduce them in just 1 minute. This program is co-sponsored with our great partners at the Never Again Coalition, who do a lot of work on human rights and labor issues and have helped to promote this program. Also with our partners at the World Affairs Councils of America, where they have partnered on many programs with the International Labor Organization, both in DC and throughout the country. Just a word or two about some other upcoming events for WorldOregon members. As a reminder, if you're not a WorldOregon member, we encourage you to become a member to help support programs like this. Doing another great human rights webinar this Thursday called 7 Doors, looking at stories of immigration along border areas in the US and around the world with multiple partners, including Human Rights Watch. That is coming up on June 3rd. Next week, we have 2 great programs, one on China with the author Sam Kaplan from Seattle, and on the autobiography, I should say, by American Dreamer by Tim Tran, a success story of someone who immigrated to the US from Vietnam in the wreckage of the war and went on to an incredible life here in Oregon. So that's coming up later this week and next week. All those are on our website, worldoregon.org. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded for posting on YouTube. Only the panelists' audio and video will be on. Everyone in the audience, you will have yours muted, but you can post questions in the chat. Excuse me, in the Q&A. In the chat, we'll post links to different items of interest. And now to introduce briefly our participants. Speaking first is Kevin Cassidy. He has almost 4 decades of international development experience. He's currently the director and representative to the Bretton Woods multilateral organizations for the ILO office for the US. And Kevin is going to talk about the International Labor Organization and its work. And that will then lead to some more examples from Theo Chocolate, where we have Monique Heineman and Lindstrom, and you can see Aaron has a great background with all the chocolates up for display. They're going to talk about where sort of the rubber meets the road, where an industry and a socially conscious enterprise really dives into this. We're thrilled to have them all join us. I should note that when I was in the Foreign Service, we were just talking before this started, my last posting, I was labor attaché at the US Embassy in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, and we looked at different labor and human rights issues, how they crossed over, especially in the lead up to the now Central America Free Trade Agreement. So it's a key issue. We're thrilled to be partnering with them. We're gonna pass it off to Kevin, and then you'll see Theo Chocolate folks come up in just a couple minutes. Kevin, the floor is yours.
Great. Derek, thank you very much. And to WorldOregon, I really appreciate the invitation. Many people do not know what the International Labor Organization is. I think when most people think about it, they think labor, it's just about trade unions, but it's so much more. The ILO is actually the first multilateral organization. It came into being at the Treaty of Versailles. We are Section 13 in the Treaty of Versailles, and we were created alongside the League of Nations. So this is a precursor to the UN. The ILO has a unique characteristic. It is a technical agency of the UN, and it has standing in the major organs of the United Nations system, the General Assembly, Economic and Social Council, and Security Council. And we take the floor and we speak about these issues in those bodies as well. The ILO has the only tripartite nature in its organizational structure. And what does that mean? It means that you not only have governments for an intergovernmental discussion, but you also have the workers and employers of each country sitting down together, discussing these issues, coming at that as equals, and bringing their concerns to bear. These are the actors of the real economy. You want to know from the employers who are investing their money, their time, their energy in creating products and services for the world to make it a better place, as well as the workers, yourselves, myself, and others, who are trading our skills, our talent, our time, our industry, in order to be a part of a special delivery, whether it is a process or a product or a service itself. So this tripartite nature is very important when we set what we call our third sort of element, which is our standard setting nature. The ILO has a normative role. There aren't very many international organizations that can set international standards. So what does that mean? So for the ILO, I would say you would call that the plumbing of our economy. When the ILO was created in 1919, our modern capitalist system was actually one of many competing economic models. And at the time, there weren't very many rules. I mean, you worked until you couldn't work anymore or you died. I mean, work was just something that consumed your life. So trading your time and skills for a fair remuneration was something that the ILO was very much involved with at the very beginning. And maybe all jokes aside, but the weekend was brought to you by the ILO. Our first convention is on hours of work. It set the parameters for what work meant: time to work, to earn a living, and then time to take off, to rest, the body to rejuvenate, and to be able to spend the money that we have earned with our skills and our talents. The ILO not only sets these rules, and it's not the bureaucrats at the ILO that do that. It is the government workers and employers, the representatives, the member states that are setting these rules. Everything we look at, from domestic workers, we look at violence and harassment in the workplace, we look at maritime labor conventions, we look at the issues of family responsibilities, we look at time off, we look at conditions of work, we look at pay, we look at occupational safety and health. The ILO is about the world of work, and the world of work is an important place because it sits at that nexus between the economic and the social. And why is that important? Today, if you think about people who have lost their jobs, massive loss of job, and I can talk a little bit about COVID-19 and its impact on the economy, which is far worse than the Great Depression back in the 30s, and even worse than the 2008, 2009 financial crisis. When you lose your job, you lose your contact with your network of people who can help you find your next job. You may lose your house. You'll have to move, find a job that may not pay you as much as you had been paid in the past. You may not get the benefits. Today, most workers, and particularly on these digital labor platforms, where young workers today will never know what it means to have a pension. They may not ever have a company provided healthcare plan for themselves. And all of this is really important, because if people lose their jobs, they lose their wherewithal, they lose their connection to reality, they lose their sense of worth in many ways, right? Because we are defined by the work that we do. You take many countries where there's massive unemployment, that leads to social unrest, and social unrest then spills into the political sphere. So working is very, very important. So the ILO has this tripartite nature. We're a part of the UN system. We work on international standards and norms, but we are also an economic actor. The ILO sits at the table with the G7, the G20, the OECD, the World Bank, the IMF. I, in Washington, represent my organization and speak with these, as we call them, the Bretton Woods Institution, which is actually a ski resort up in New Hampshire, where before the end of World War II, the international financial system was decided. And we sit down with these entities to understand how we create fiscal space for countries to be able to draw themselves out of poverty. And I'll show you a couple of ways in which the ILO is connected to the US. For example, the ILO, in its opening paragraph, in its preamble, talks about how peace and security can only be established if it is based upon social justice. And social justice is about peace in not only wartime, but I mean peace coming out of wartime into normal economies. But social justice is the equal application of law to everyone. And in our foundational documents, that exists in our Constitution, in our preamble. In 1944, another one of our foundational documents is the Declaration of Philadelphia, which talks about labor is not a commodity, and that poverty anywhere constitutes a danger to prosperity everywhere. I'll give you an example. Many people we talk to at the UN, and I've spent 37 years of my career and almost my whole career working at the UN and its systems. We talk about how you can have, for example, food security. Now, take sub-Saharan Africa, for example, where 80% of the population work in subsistence farming. You could bring in these big, GPS-enabled combine harvesters. Everyone could have food if they could afford it. But what do you do with the tens of millions of people, the 78 to 80% of the people working on these farms? What do? I mean, people need to have some livelihood. They need to earn the funding that they can pay their rent and put food on the table, send their kids to school, create opportunities for themselves. And so this is really what's important about the world of work. I'll talk a little bit now about how COVID-19 has impacted on the global markets and how the ILO is working with many of the UN institutions themselves. COVID-19, as I think we've all seen, has massively impacted upon the labor markets. We've lost about nearly 9% of global working hours, which is equivalent to 255 million full-time jobs. Now, just think about 255 million. This is more than the working population in the United States. I mean, if everyone lost their jobs, I mean, this is a global figure. I mean, what do people do? And a majority of those who lost their jobs now have just translated into inactivity, which means that you have about 81 million people that are not returning to the workplace. And they're not returning to the workplace because they're getting great benefits from the government, or that they just decide that they've made too much money and now they can sit back and relax. It's just that people have dropped out because they are unable to find work. The economic opportunities are not there, or there's restrictions because they haven't maybe been vaccinated, or because of the exposure to pathogens, which will now always be a mega driver in our world today. Just can't find work that will replace the work that they've had before. So this is actually impacted in a sort of a disproportionate way across the labor market. Women, and particularly women of color, young people, have been mostly affected. And they will probably not find the same level of activities when they go back into the labor market, mainly because there are millions of more young people coming into that labor market, so effectively crowding them out, or even creating a downward pressure on wages. We've lost globally about $3.7 trillion of the global domestic product. I mean, we've seen how global supply chains have shown themselves to be threadbare. We have seen that people don't have access to childcare, right? And this is why women are particularly affected. Women couldn't go back because they didn't want to bring other people in. They weren't sure if their children might be infected by this pathogen, COVID-19. They could not afford to pay for childcare, even if they had somebody they trusted with their children, because I think, as many people out there will see, is that childcare probably is more expensive than the salaries that people can that they can earn for themselves. So what have we seen along this? So we've seen that this large reduction of working hours, has been disproportional. And in a lot of countries where they've had very generous benefits, the countries have actually bounced back a lot better. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, where they had a high level of post-support income, there was only a decline of about 3% in job loss. But other countries which did not have this, and we talk about fiscal space, basically the money to pay for services. And so in developing countries, or countries with large informal economies that don't have social safety nets, these are the countries that lost a lot. I mentioned about young workers. So we are seeing that young workers between 15 and 24 have really suffered quite a lot in this. For example, in the US, it's been a bit modest at 2% of losing their jobs. But in Peru or in Vietnam, we're seeing 18 to 22% of young people losing their jobs. COVID has also negatively impacted upon people who are self-employed. So, and this has to do with the type of jobs that people have. Not everybody can phone it in. Not everybody can telework. I mean, a bus driver, a police officer, a fireman, a teacher, someone who stocks the shelves, somebody who's cooking the food at the restaurant. I mean, these are people who have to be on the front line. They are essential workers. In the Lower East Side of Manhattan, bicycle repair shops, these were essential workers, because people were needing their bicycles to get around and to travel independently, because they didn't want to be taking the subways, and maybe they would become infected. So with the impact of COVID-19 has been really quite terrible in terms of the world of work. So what is the ILO doing? So the ILO works with, as I mentioned, with, for example, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to help strengthen these social safety nets. Many of the international buyers in the sort of global supply chains just stopped making orders. People weren't going out to retail shops. People were not sure if they would have the money, so they wanted to hold on to their money instead of just buying online. I mean, online did benefit from the pandemic. But in the beginning, people were not sure how long it would last. So when you start to look at how these situations create problems for people, we had to work with the World Bank, which are lending to the least developed countries, working with the International Monetary Fund to ensure that people had access to healthcare, they had access to remote education, that they had access to some income support for themselves, because not all countries can actually pay for that. And even the major brands are changing. For example, the modes of production have changed as well too. I think that there was an article recently, some of you may have seen, where the ketchup packets, for example, in McDonald's or in any fast food place, you couldn't get them because they've all shifted to sort of big bottles of ketchup that people would go to the big box stores and buy and bring home for themselves, right? So the modes of production have changed. The global supply chains, we couldn't find the PPEs for ourselves. So we need to sort of look at macroeconomic policies, re-envision our world, our global supply chains to make that work better. Groups like the World Trade Organization wanted to ensure that our global trade, trade has just been increasing, that we have this hyper globalization now. We don't always have access to the goods that we need. How many of you out there ran to the store to buy 3 or 4 big packages of toilet paper because we didn't know if we would be able to get that, to get those masks for ourselves? So it really demonstrated how important it was to really look at our economy and see how we could ensure that the world of work continued to move along. I just would like to stop here with one quote that I use. About 3 years ago, on the centenary of the ILO, I traveled around the United States to 15 states, to over 80 cities, and I spoke to 185 workers, kind of like a Studs Terkel working tour. And I spoke to so many different people to catch an inspiration about what work meant to them. This was before COVID. And even after COVID, this quote really stuck with me. And it's actually a quote from Martin Luther King, given in March of 1968 on that weekend in which he was assassinated. But he said in his speech to the municipal employees during the sanitation strike that we often overlook the work and the significance of those who are not in professional jobs, people who are not in the so-called big jobs. But he said, whenever you are engaged in work that serves humanity, that is for the building of humanity, it has dignity, it has worth. So for us at the International Labor Organization, we believe that all labor has dignity. So I'll stop right there for the moment. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin, and we'll welcome our Theo Chocolate partners to come back on video and join us now.
Hello. See if Monique's on her way. There she is. Oh, I think you're still on mute, Monique.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having us out. We really appreciate it, WorldOregon. And Lauren, if you're on here, thank you so much for connecting us. And Kevin, it's great being on this panel with you. Erin is going to talk a little bit about Theo, and then I will talk a little bit more about how we source our cocoa and a recent impact report.
Yeah, so nice to meet all of you. Thanks so much for, like Monique said, letting us come hang out today. Again, my name is Erin. I'm the education manager for Theo Chocolate. So I've been working for Theo for 7 years. I run all of our educational programming, whether it's how we pivoted during the pandemic and started doing virtual chocolate tastings to creating in-person classes, lectures, all those different things. But I've also I used to work as a chocolatier in Oakland, California for 3 years. So I've been in the industry for about a decade now, which seems kind of crazy, but I've loved working for Theo Chocolate for years. So I know some of us maybe haven't heard of Theo Chocolate before. So we're gonna do a little quick background so you know who we are. And then also even a little just background, even if it's someone I'm sure a lot of y'all know, just background on where chocolate comes from and the incredible amount of work that goes into making a single bar of chocolate. Because I think if you're going to talk about labor and talk about issues of child slavery in the industry, it's important to have that back knowledge. Just know how much physical work goes into the making of a single chocolate bar. So to kind of get things, kicked off, just so you know where we come from and our history. Theo Chocolate is the first certified organic and fair trade bean-to-bar chocolate company in the United States. When we started, there were a few other bean-to-bar companies. I'll describe what that means in a moment. Nowadays, there's hundreds out there. It's kind of more the cost of entry. If you're going to start making small batch chocolate or medium batch chocolate, most companies go the bean-to-bar route. So bean-to-bar, that means that we make our chocolate from scratch. So most companies are called chocolate melters, which means they buy cocoa liquor, which is pure liquid chocolate or pure liquid cacao in bulk. They'll get that, they'll melt it, add sugar, bananas, whatever you want, turn it into a wonderful chocolate bar, and that's great. You can make fantastic chocolate that way, but to me, it's like making brownies from scratch or from a box. If you make your brownies from scratch, you are bringing all the ingredients together yourself. You're creating a flavor. If you make it from a box, it could be a delicious brownie with amazing ingredients, but somebody else put that mix together. You're then just maybe adding some like orange zest and then baking it. You're just kind of finishing it off, but it's someone else's creation. So bean-to-bar chocolate, same concept. We want everything to be, we want to have oversight over where everything's coming from, so we can have connections with farms, whether it's, farms where our cherries come from for our ganache that's made by hand in our kitchen, to the cocoa beans that goes into the chocolate. So we are bean-to-bar chocolate. Again, when we started, there were less than 10 in the United States. Now there's hundreds out there. But we were the first bean-to-bar chocolate company to be certified organic and fair trade. So to give you a little backstory, that's Theo, but on chocolate itself, chocolate comes from these cocoa pods. Which if you ever look at our logo, you'll see the O in Theo is one of these pods. These pods, the tree is gorgeous. It's ever bearing. So year round, it's giving you cocoa pods. There's a bigger summer and a bigger winter harvest. But even like the healthiest of trees is going to give you between 20 to 25 of these pods. But because it's ever bearing, at one point you could have 25 pods that are ready to be taken down, 25 more pods that need an extra 2 months, 25 more pods that are halfway there. So while a lot of crops you can shave the tree, you can, agitate the tree to have these things fall off, because each pod is upwards of 8 pounds, the stem leading to the trunk is incredibly tough. And you have all levels of growth on the tree at one point. So you can't agitate the tree, pods won't fall off. You could shave the tree, but then you sure have gotten your pods super quick, but you've also killed off all the rest of the pods on there, which also means all of your income. So these need to be taken down individually by hand. I actually got the chance, I was working on a cocoa farm in Colombia, I guess 5 years ago now. And I can't understate how labor intensive this process is. For me, I had a backpack that was made of burlap, and you're going in there with shears and a machete and taking each pod down individually. And oftentimes these pods grow in the same spot year after year. So you have to be very delicate with how you're detaching the pod from the tree. And like the pods I was working with were about 5 to 8 pounds. And I just had a bag on my back. So within a few pods, your bag's full. Walk to your station, drop them off, come back, and do this over and over and over again. And it takes about 4 or 5 of these pods to make your average 70% dark chocolate bar. So that's the part that always blows my mind is, when you just have a single chocolate bar, that took maybe 10 minutes of harvesting upward, and that's one of the, why you want to make sure the farmers that are doing this are, obviously not going to be doing this against their will. It's incredibly dangerous and tricky farming to be doing. And once this process is done, once you have your pods, the inside of the pod, not the most attractive thing in the world, it is this fruit. So it's a very sticky, slimy, gooey fruit that is going to be encasing seeds. So all these seeds and the fruit will be scooped out together and fermented. People usually don't correlate chocolate with fermentation, but fermentation is key to developing your flavor. That's the first step in developing flavor. So cocoa that comes from Congo, which is where we source our cocoa from, is going to have one flavor profile. Cocoa that comes from Peru or from Venezuela or Ghana all depends on terroir, where your cocoa is being fermented. And so once the beans ferment for about 7 days or so, they'll turn brown. That's how you eventually get your color in your chocolate. They're then dried out in the sun. You can see massive drying beds here. And all these, there's numerous ways to ferment. There's numerous ways to dry. What you're seeing here is a much more advanced method of drying. It's with elevated drying beds that allow for circulation, so all excess gas that built up during fermentation can evaporate. A more common way you'll see cocoa dried is just on the ground. Just rake beans out on concrete, which can work, but since concrete's porous, the gases just seep in and linger. So while you think you're drying your beans, a lot of that gas is being retained. Take your batch off, put your next batch down, they're just getting recoated. So this is a much more preferred method of drying. And once they have been dried, they're gonna be brought for Theo to a buying center where quality checks are gonna be done before they are shipped out to us here in Seattle. And that's where we take over and to make our chocolate. First thing we'll do is roast. So if any of y'all ever come up here to Seattle and you want to find us, it's pretty easy because there's about a 3-block radius around our building where it just smells like brownies. And that's because of the roasting. So the fermentation, that's what kicked off flavor. Roasting is what's going to accentuate it. After we roast, we take off that, there's a little husk that builds outside, take off the outside husk. You have cocoa nib. And then we have multiple machines that mill those nibs down. So it's kind of like with peanuts. If you grind peanuts, you get peanut butter. If you grind coffee, you get powder because there's no fat. There's a lot of natural fat in the nibs. So when we apply heat and pressure, it turns it into a liquid called cocoa liquor. So buying the beans that have the flavor profile we're looking for, roasting to our perfection, or to our to the flavor profile we're looking for, milling the beans down to the right micron size to get the right texture of cocoa liquor. Those are all steps that we do because we're bean to bar. If we were chocolate melters, buying that cocoa liquor, that would be step one. But that's one of the many things that makes us, stand out amongst the pack when it comes to making chocolate.
Thank you, Aaron. And I'm going to also show some slides here because I think pictures are pretty. So we'll do that. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how Theo sources cocoa and the deep transparency that we do in order to make sure people know about our business practices. We were founded in 2005 and started selling cocoa or chocolate bars, in 2006. Our mission is that as a company rooted in cocoa, our mission is to create a more beautiful, compassionate, and enduring world by responsibly making delicious and inspiring products for everyone. And Theo Chocolate was founded to create a positive impact through chocolate. So we're mission driven. It's part of the DNA of everything we do. And since 2012, we've actually been purchasing and kind of slowly ramped up purchases of cocoa beans from Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. And that partnership and that purchasing arrangement started by being introduced to some people from Eastern Congo Initiative, which is an NGO, along with a trading partner called Esco Kivu, who was working in the region. And they had identified cocoa and growing cocoa as a militia-proof crop. And they wanted to figure out how they could encourage farmers to start farming it in the region because there has been a long history of violence and conflict in Eastern DRC. And the community we now source from is called Watalinga. It's, that was the close in of the close in map. It's surrounded by Virunga National Park. And it's, really amazing impact as farmers decided to start growing cocoa and the impact that that has had. So Theo participates in this as the commercial partner, and we dedicate and have committed to purchasing cocoa beans from the Watalinga cocoa farmers. Recently, we released our 2020 impact report, and We do this because we feel like it's, like I mentioned, transparency is incredibly important to us. Because we're mission driven, because we strive to have a positive impact, it's important to us that consumers and the community know that we don't just say words, that we're actually doing them, and that we're putting these practices into real life situations and actually doing what we say we do. A couple of ways that we ensure ethical sourcing, and that we kind of pillars to how we work in ethical sourcing. The first is that we have direct relationships with farmers and the community that we buy cocoa beans from. So while there's a company called Esko Kivu who buys the beans directly from the farmers, we still go to visit, and we visited quite a lot in the beginning of the relationship to meet farmers, to meet school teachers, to meet the Cocoa Farmer Association, so that we understand what's happening with people in real time. Currently, there are over 7,000 cocoa farmers that are registered in the Wadalingo Cocoa Program that we source from. And the purchases of cocoa beans that go into Theo Chocolate support their extended family members, which now is up to 70,000 people. The other element and key pillar of how we source that ensures that we're having a positive impact is that we pay living wages. On the top left of this chart, you'll see the average price that we pay to cocoa farmers per metric ton. And the process that Erin described of someone buying chocolate from someone that's already been made, and then they melt down the chocolate, they may have an idea of how much, that was paid for a price called freight on board, which is when it's exported out of the country, which is what most people report on. But if you don't have direct visibility and direct relationships with farmers and with the trading partners that are doing the work, then you don't know how much farmers are being paid. So we do work to ensure that farmers are being paid a living wage. Through the visits, there was some interviews that were done this past year. The Esko Kivu hired an outside person to come in and interview farmers to understand their living conditions and ask some kind of questions around their housing conditions, around the ability to send children to school. And what we found that was really amazing is that people are able to save money, which is a key part of living wages. So people are saving money if there's emergencies, they're able to invest in more land to increase their income. And so this is a very critical part to us. The base price that we pay for cocoa beans includes that living wage price to farmers. It then includes a price of also sustainably running sourcing programs in Eastern DRC with Esko Kivu's costs. And those prices get us to about 39% above conventional market prices for cocoa beans and about 13% above the Fair Trade International organic minimum prices. So we're proud of that approach, and we continue to refine and ensure that the price being paid to farmers is a living wage. In addition to both the direct relationships, living wages, we also pay a premium that's included in that FOB price that's a development fund project. So this is part of what makes fair trade unique, is that there's a kind of a premium that's paid out into a co-op. For us, it's the Wadalingo Cocoa Farmer Association. So it's $200 a metric ton. In 2020, that amounted to $300,000. And what's really exciting is that this is all community-driven development. So it is not Theo saying, use these funds to develop XYZ projects in your community. It's the farmers getting together and deciding what the needs are in the community. From the chart here, you can see that about half of the money goes back as cash to the farmers for additional income. But they've also focused a huge amount of the rest of that money on education infrastructure, from rehabbing education facilities to building new schools to even building a local university. So that's still, construction is in process. And one of the really outstanding things that we learned from the community is that because of the focus on education, one of the key issues in cocoa growing and agricultural issues is child forced labor, right? And is child labor. And a child needs access to education and education infrastructure in order to be able to go to school and not work on a family farm. And they've built out enough schools that there's now 3,900 kids who are able to go to school that weren't previously. So that partnership has been really exciting, and we appreciate the Farmer Association and how they've prioritized projects, because it's really making a difference in their community also. The last key element that we focus on in terms of making sure that people know that we're doing what we say we are is that we do third-party verifications. So we're Fair Trade certified from Fair for Life, which both certifies the product, so it ensures that the people growing the product are paid a fair wage, but it also goes all the way through our supply chain, all the way to our factory here in Fremont and Seattle, which looks at our employment practices even in Seattle. And then we're certified organic. And we do that not just for the people who want to buy organic products, we also do it for farmers. So because smallholder farmers tend to grow their cocoa near their home, if they're applying pesticides in their home space and in their home farms, it actually ends up in the community. It ends up with their families. So we prioritize organic for both the end consumer, but also the producer. I think the last element I wanted to bring forward from the impact report and is thinking about how companies, their responsibility to the people to partner fairly with the people that they're purchasing from and paying living wages is a story from this past year. So this is the Cocoa Farmer Association that I mentioned. This is one of their annual meetings. And over the past year, in the end of 2019, so over a year ago, there's been an increase in violence in Eastern DRC, and there was insecurity and conflict and violence within the Wadalinga community. And so the community members left. They fled their homes, they were displaced, and they moved outside of a town called Nobili and lived in displacement spaces or with friends and family in Nobili. And would go up into their farms during the day when it was safer, bring the cocoa pods down to Nobili, and then ferment in the places that they were displaced into. Esco Kivu, our buying partner, pivoted. They closed the buying stores also for safety of their employees, but also because the farmers had moved out of those communities, and then opened more buying stores in Nobili. And when we think about having a positive impact through sourcing, I think this story is very profound. In the time that the farmers were displaced, there was very little aid that went into this specific community. It's very isolated. There's actually not roads that connect Wadalinga to the rest of DRC. Their roads are all open with Uganda. And the Uganda border closed during the beginning of the COVID pandemic. So there was very little coming into the community to support people through the displacement. But the community was able to persevere and had the resilience of continued access to income through cocoa pods and cocoa growing. So when we talk about it as a militia-proof crop, it truly is because of the process that Aaron described of that, being really careful in how you're both harvesting it, but then the fermentation and drying process that needs to happen afterwards is not something that a militia that is going through a community can pull cocoa pods and then harvest and easily sell that product. And so now the community at the end of 2020 and beginning of 2021 has moved back into their homes. So instead of the displacement destroying the community and having them become refugees, potentially in Uganda or in other areas of DRC, the community has been stabilized because of economic access through this displacement. And we think it's a really strong example of what commerce can do, what a business can do when they partner fairly with farmers. And that is what we have to tell you about Theo.
Great, thanks a lot, Monique. This is Tim DeRoche, the Director of Programs for WorldOregon. Great presentations by all three of you. We've got some really good questions coming in from folks. And I want to start with one from our dear friend Lauren Fortgang from the Never Again Coalition. And she's got a two-part question here. So Theo is an industry leader in ethical standards, but as we know, many other companies are falling far behind on issues including child labor and responsible and ethical sourcing. So what can consumers do to push for higher standards with other companies in the chocolate sector? And then secondly, what is the ILO doing in the sector to enforce these standards? And you can all three just jump in as you see fit.
I can start from a consumer perspective. I would ensure that you're buying chocolate from companies that prioritize ethical sourcing. So we know at Theo Chocolate that there is no forced child labor in our supply chain. And it's important. And the reason we know that is because of how we've structured the business and how we've structured how we buy. So we purposefully, for example, don't buy from Ghana and Ivory Coast, where the issue is rampant with child trafficking and forced child labor. If you have a company that you love, you need to contact them and let them know that this issue is important to you, because it is a critical issue in cocoa that needs to be addressed.
I was going to say the same thing, just support of the companies that are doing the right thing, because the more you support, the more money gets flooded into that industry, the more companies like Theo, I mean, blanket statement, only buy Theo chocolate, but the more companies like Theo that do things that Theo do can become more well known, which then puts more pressure on bigger companies that should be hopefully following suit.
I'm going to speak generally. I don't know Theo's. We mostly work in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, since that's 70% of the cocoa market today. I'm glad to see that you're paying above market. Just be careful about using the word living wage. I don't know if you do salary surveys. We do. That doesn't sound like it's a living wage. If you're talking about harvest, you've got 3 harvests of cocoa per year. Most farms are 1 to 3 hectares. You can get probably 1 metric ton per hectare. So your price is it. That's what a farmer gets for a year, and he'll normally have 5, 6 kids, maybe 1 or 2 other men working with them. So the money that goes down, it's not just the farmer, it's the workers for the farmer as well too. So it's tough. But again, I'm very glad that you guys are paying above market rates. What we find that's happening on the ground is that it's a multiplicity of problems. And some of you who may have seen this Netflix series Rotten, there's something called Bitter Harvest or Bitter Chocolate, I think it's called. It shows the problem. Small hectare farms, rural areas, lots and lots of kids not going to school. So lots of people in the labor market available to work. Kids are working sometimes just for food or for shelter because it's such a poor area. They then aggregate their crops. There is somebody who will then take it in their truck in very poor infrastructure, a road which is maybe 15 miles long to the aggregator. May take 3 days to get to. So there is, the price paid at the farm. So depends on how you structure your payments and who you're working with directly. Then that gets aggregated and sent to the bigger cities. That's aggregated even further, very slim margins. And then it goes to the ports where it's being processed by the bigger companies. And those bigger companies, their profit margins are extraordinarily high. So again, it's very good that you're working directly with the growers. So we work with the governments because we are an international organization. We work with the government workers and employers. We work with the labor inspectorates. I think that's really quite important. We are also working with the communities. Community monitoring and integrated child monitoring systems is very, very important. There has to be a social safety net. I mentioned before this idea about creating social protection systems and also ensuring that there may be a program in place for the government. For example, in Brazil, they had something called Bolsa Familia, where they would take the kids out of child labor, provide a conditional cash transfer to the family to ensure that the child was going to school. That was the parents' job, but then they would get money in order for that, for them to supplant the income lost by the child going to school rather than going to work. But at the bottom of this sort of chain are very poor people who will just do anything just to survive. And a poor, illiterate child will grow up to be a poor, illiterate, adult, not contributing fully to that society and not growing the economy. So So it's a lot of issues packed into one. But again, not talking about Theo's, but talking generally, where we see in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire a multiplicity of problems, and the big companies unfortunately have not done what they have promised to do so far. We're getting there, but we're still not yet there.
So, Kevin, as a follow-up, we were talking a little bit before the program about the WTO, and there is a new head of the WTO, the first African woman to head the WTO. And I'm wondering how you see this affecting some of these issues around forced labor or child labor or exploitation. And I'm curious also from the Theo perspective, what are chocolate workers and people like that, especially in the DRC, thinking about the fact that Ngozi is now a voice for Africa in a large entity like the WTO?
If you would like, Ngozi, an African woman heading up the WTO, fantastic. Most of the UN agencies are headed up by Western men. So very good to see the diversity. That's very, very important. She will bring a sensitivity to Africa, obviously herself being Nigerian. But there's very little that the machinery can do regardless who's at the head. There may be a new vision, but the machinery is the machinery. Back in the 80s, there was a Singapore conference when the WTO was first started. We tried to address the issue of labor standards in global supply chains and in trade agreements. The WTO said, we're not dealing with that. That's the ILO's deal. We don't deal with social clauses or social labeling. So the ILO's fundamental rights, no child labor, no forced labor, no discrimination, freedom of association, collective bargaining, those are the 4 fundamental rights. These are now embedded within trade agreements, in framework agreements. It's in the USMCA, it's in a number of others. So I think the important thing is to say that you have to take a whole of UN approach, human rights approach, trade approach, labor approach, and we have to work together with local entities, ensure that they're properly funded through the World Bank, through the IMF, giving fiscal space for that, and then encouraging employers to do the right thing. We've got the Hark and Engel protocol that did something, to move in the right direction, but still with public-private partnerships, if things are voluntary, they don't necessarily work. If they are mandatory, like we see with CBP and the withhold and release orders of forced labor for products made with forced labor, that is when companies stand up and take notice. And unfortunately, it's a bit of a blunt instrument, but that seems to be working. Over.
Anything from either of you?
I think that the WTO and who heads that is not something we really spend a lot of time talking with our partners in the DRC about. We spend a lot of time talking with them about crops and what's coming up and are the costs right and how we look for a path forward. So I think that we're kind of in a different space of how that affects us or how that affects the people that we work with.
From a workforce standpoint, I thought this, and then we got a question about this, which addressed it as well, as talking about gender dimensions. And I noticed this with the photo that you showed. There were no obvious female faces in this community meeting photo. And certainly there is a history of violence against women in that area. And I'm wondering from both the Theo stance and from the ILO, how are some of these issues around gender and workforce and equity addressed?
I mean, from our point of view, gender equality is absolutely essential. When you have women who are gainfully employed or women who are educated, societies seem to do better, both economically and also politically. So gender is a very, very important issue for us all. I'm just also noticing a question about cobalt. When you talk about the DRC, we have a project there working on cobalt because everybody who is here on a laptop or on a computer, cobalt is in their batteries, rare earth elements are in their microchips. This artisanal mining that is being done is also being done by kids, and cobalt and coltan in its raw form, which is another element in DRC that's harvested by children, is radioactive and will threaten their lives. So we have to work with the World Health Organization to look at what elements are there. And usually when you have women who are in society and leadership positions, they will encourage the children to go to school. They will have gender responsive policies. Girls will be educated. Girls will take leadership roles. So all of this, the economics and the social sphere are all mixed up in the economy. So very, very important that women do have leadership roles. Very, very important that we do work as a whole of UN approach rather than individual agencies, UNICEF doing schools, WTO doing trade, ILO doing labor. We find what we're good at, but we all work together in a comprehensive integrated toolbox approach.
And Erin, please jump in on this answer too from a Theo perspective. One of the things that I think is important to know is that what's interesting is at the Farmer Association meeting, there's a small handful of women that do attend, but there are more women who are farmers, and accessibility of getting to that meeting for whatever reason, based on how the society is structured, is limited. And one of the elements is that we do visit women farmers when we're there. There's some farmer interviews that are on our website right now that we're, in the absence of us being able to go visit and ensure that what we're paying is moving forward people's standard of living, there's quite a few women that are interviewed there, and that we've seen other interviews also from women. What you do see is a lot of the women are widows, so they're supporting a larger family without a husband anymore. And the men that we tend to talk to tend to have families, including wives. So I think that there's a flexibility based on living situations in terms of access to cocoa and how cocoa growing occurs. There was some time that we spent helping provide additional funding to start up a maternity health clinic. And when it was opened, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, so I apologize, but the maternity death rates dramatically dropped. Maternity death rates were very high for women when they were giving birth, and the clinic has really dramatically improved that just by general access to healthcare that's maternity and birth specific. So it's something that's real, and it's a gender difference in the culture and in the area, and it's we try and be really sensitive to what's happening and support the community where they're at, and meet them where they're at, and help work with them to move forward, to support the community moving forward where they'd like to go.
And don't have much to add in, but even when you talk about fair trade, going all the way from cocoa farming to us here in Seattle, a lot of that also affects us here in the factory. We've started up a diversity and inclusion committee, making sure we're hearing from our employees, trying to make sure our workforce reflects who we are as a business. And we've done a lot in the last, I guess it's almost been a year now since we opened up the diversity and inclusion committee, who are still trying to do as much as possible.
Great. So you're talking a lot about the community in which the cocoa is grown. Has the volcano eruption near Goma and the people subsequently fleeing into the Kivu area of the Northeast DRC, has that impacted your production at all, or the farmers that you were working with?
It actually hasn't. So it's further south than Watalinga is. There's kind of a full lake in between Watalinga and where the volcano is erupting. So the kind of mass displacement you see occurring as lava is going is not impacting the community that we're sourcing from. Watalinga is incredibly isolated from the rest of DRC. There's one road that goes over to Beni, and it's actually impassable. It was overtaken by militias and has either, through time of people not crossing it, become impassable, or there's still militias holding parts of it, so it's unsafe to pass through. So the DRC area that we source from only really interacts with Uganda.
So one thing that I didn't really hear come up too much from either of you was climate change, and how are climate change issues being addressed in the cocoa industry, and what are the long-term projections in terms of workforce and trade in places like the DRC or the areas that the ILO is working in?
And it's a great question because, climate change is one aspect of that, where you have weather patterns that are changing. And of course, that's going to change where the plantations of the farms are going to be most productive. But I think overall, many of these plantations, at least the farming techniques that are used there, and also in palm oil, and then increasingly now what we see in artisanal mining, gold mining that's being used as well too, is that it's extraordinarily destructive, to the environment. The degradation on in the land is really quite incredible. People don't have the techniques in farming or trained in those techniques. And what you have, just think about normally developing countries which are exporting raw commodities. Whether it is cotton and cattle and cobalt or coca, all of these are raw materials. If they started developing industries themselves and adding value added, the country would do better for itself. If it brought in appropriate technology to look at these issues, it would be useful. There are organizations in the UN Environmental Program, but you also have the Sustainable Development Goals, which are really quite important. The ILO is very engaged. I myself personally negotiated Goal 8 on decent work and productive employment at the UN in the Third Committee of the General Assembly when that came out back in 2015. And work is central to all of that, because if we are polluting the land, if we are polluting the oceans, and we're destroying the base in which we have, if child labor prevails, then people will remain poor, people will remain hungry. Women who are not into the workforce, women who are not educated, they will not actually then be able to be empowered. So it is really quite important that we look at, the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, these 17 ambitious goals, as a cohesive whole, as a blueprint for us, not only in the developed world. Of course, we're being impacted. Farmers in the Midwest, their fields are flooded. You can't plant in flooded fields. And that's not in developing countries. That's right here in the US. So I think we have to look at climate change and the impact on that. And where are we going from here? How are we taking advantage? How do we transition to a low carbon economy, and where that's most effective? And I think it's incumbent upon the developed world to provide that technological transfer to the developing countries so they don't suffer the same fate that we have largely avoided. But if we don't take action now, we will suffer from that as well.
I think on the, if you kind of narrow in on growing cocoa, as Kevin mentioned, it's very destructive environmentally. There's huge deforestation that has occurred across Ghana and Ivory Coast over the past 50 years of growing cocoa. And so one of the things we've been doing is, since we're really trying to avoid the same fate in Eastern DRC and in the Watalinga community, particularly part of the reason I show the map with how it's surrounded by Virunga National Park is that the community we source from has a national park around it. And one of the issues that happens is that people will start encroaching on national parks and begin deforesting national parks in order to start growing more cocoa. And it's all in an effort to increase wages, right? It's based off of poverty and a need to increase wages. So we've done a couple of things. The first is we work with ESCO Kivu, and they have 17 agronomists on staff who have a cocoa farm school for farmers when they're first starting, and then also do technological or kind of specific consulting as needed with various farmers. And one of the things that they have integrated within the farm curriculum is the idea of kind of a multi-story crops. So cocoa is not the only item being grown on a farm, both for crop diversification and income diversification, but also for biodiversity and maintenance of the tree canopy, which can grow above cocoa trees, which is helpful. The other thing that we're doing is we started working with UNAID and kind of looking at if there was a way for us to do a project with Virunga National Park. And we've started the process of thinking about how do we start mapping all of the farms so that we can look over the years and see if there's encroachment that's happening within the national park, along with figuring out as the cocoa trees start to be, hit their 10-year mark, a little bit above that, and may become less fruitful, less efficient, like growing less product on each tree. How do we start agricultural products that look at, can farmers start grafting on additional trees? Do we start a nursery with additional trees that are then provided out to farmers so that their productivity doesn't decline? And that productivity decline is part of the pressure to get out into the different outside of people's farms and into national parks. So we're working on a couple of different things, particularly around the environment, because cocoa has such a multifaceted impact on deforestation.
So in both of your presentations, certain things rose to the surface. Consuming responsibly, labor worker issues. Kevin, you brought up, the disruption of supply chain that really, we became much more aware of during the pandemic. So I'm wondering, do you see a momentum building for a new labor movement globally? And how does an ordinary citizen communicate to a broad base of why that really matters?
Yeah. Labor rights are human rights. When you start to look at how people who are represented, who have voice, who are not in an asymmetrical power relationship, they do better. And this has been shown out and brought out in many different studies. So I do think that when you start looking at how people themselves are fairly sharing in the wealth that they have helped to generate, whether you are a manager of a company or whether you are a worker in the company or you're the owner of the company, you want to retain good staff. You pay good wages, right? I mean, you want to retain, good, talented and artisans. You pay the wages that are necessary to retain them. Otherwise, it takes a long time to replace people in that marketplace. So I do feel that now with the shift, and I would say in this particular new administration, there is an emphasis on labor. There is actually even labor rights are being viewed in the NSC. I mean, this is something that we haven't seen for a very long time. So we're very encouraged by that movement. This is also the International Year for the Elimination of Child Labor. I put a link into the chat function here. The 12th of June is also the World Day Against Child Labor. Over the last 20 years, child labor has gone down by 100 million children. That's had a positive impact on the world of work around us, and not just about work, but about people and their families, right? Because when money goes into the community, that creates a greater velocity of income, that creates a greater portion of the pie that people can actually generate for themselves. So I do believe that focusing on protecting people, providing people with opportunity, right? We're sentient beings. We're not a piece of wood. We don't go into a sawmill on one end and come out fully finished the other. We're not pigeons. We don't go away and die. I mean, we want to do better for ourselves. We want to be defined by the good work that we do. We want to provide for our families. So I think if we view this not as labor is here and it's bad because they want more money than the company will pay, I think if you sit down and discuss this, dialogue is absolutely essential, whether you're speaking to farmers, speaking to businesses. And that's why the ILO has a tripartite structure, to bring those voices to the table and come up with a compromise. And compromise is not a dirty word. It is not a weakness. It is a way how we, through policy, move forward as a society.
Well, we are getting up towards the end of our hour. Kevin, great stuff from you and from Aaron and Monique. Clearly, a spoonful of ethically sourced chocolate helps the medicine go down. I want to bring Derek back on to take us out into the day, and I want to thank you for all your contributions and all the great questions from people in the audience.
So thanks again, excuse me, thanks again everyone for joining us today. Huge thanks to the International Labor Organization, Theo Chocolate, Never Again Coalition, the World Affairs Councils of America. It's great to partner on this, especially an issue where really there is positive headway being made. And just thank you for tuning in and for making this a priority. Look forward to seeing you at our future programs. I mentioned this week and next. All of those are up on our website, WorldOregon.org. If you know someone who would enjoy this program but missed it today, keep an eye out, and probably by the end of this week, early next week, it'll be up on our YouTube channel. So thanks again, and enjoy the chocolate.